My son handed me a birthday card at the dinner table. Inside was a legal document demanding I sign over control of my money. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story, because the part that changes everything doesn't come at the beginning. It comes quietly, the way truth usually does, right when you've stopped expecting it. And if you're watching from somewhere I've never heard of, drop your city in the comments. I've been amazed at how far these stories travel. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I'm 67 years old. I live in the same house in Asheville, North Carolina, where I raised 2 children, planted 3 rose gardens, and buried a husband I loved for 41 years. Dennis died on a Tuesday in February, 26 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and cruel, the way that particular disease tends to be. We had 8 months from diagnosis to the end, and we used every single one of them. We talked more in those 8 months than we probably had in the decade before. Not because we'd been a distant couple, we hadn't, but because when time becomes finite, you stop saving things for later. He held my hand and told me things I already knew and things I'd never suspected. He cried twice, which I'd never seen in 41 years. Once when we told the children, and once, alone with me, the week before the end. You're going to be fine. He told me that last week. But you're going to have to learn to say no. I thought he meant to salespeople, to charitable solicitations, to neighbors asking favors. Dennis had always been the firmer one between us, the one who could politely decline without a week of guilt afterward. I didn't understand what he actually meant until much later. Our son Gerald is 44. He works in commercial real estate in Charlotte. Or he did, I'll get to that. He married Vivian 16 years ago. And for the first several years I genuinely liked her. She was sharp, organized, direct in a way that took some getting used to but that I eventually came to appreciate. They have 2 children, Cassidy, who's 19 now, and Brody, who's 16. Our daughter Renata is 41. Unmarried, lives in Portland. She and I have always been closer. Though distance makes that complicated. She calls more than she visits. Which is probably honest about what most long-distance relationships actually look like. And then there's Eli. Eli is Gerald's son from a brief relationship before Vivian, not raised by Gerald. Mostly, though Gerald paid support and they had a relationship of varying warmth over the years. Eli is 23 now, works at a plant nursery outside Asheville, and has the kind of quietness about him that makes you feel, somehow, that you're in good company even when neither of you is speaking. He started coming by the house about 3 months after Dennis died. Just to check in, he said. I didn't realize until much later how much those visits were holding me together. The financial unraveling started, and I want to be precise here. Because I've gone back and thought about this carefully, it started at Dennis's memorial reception. Not the funeral, the reception afterward, at our house, when the neighbors had brought enough casseroles to feed a small country and people were standing in the living room holding plates and saying the same 6 or 7 things people say. And Gerald pulled me into the kitchen and lowered his voice. Mom, I need to talk to you about something practical. I know the timing is terrible. But it's actually important because of timing. I remember nodding. I was so deep in grief that I was essentially agreeable to anything that didn't require me to cry in front of someone. Vivian and I have been upside down on the rental property for 2 years. We've been handling it, but with everything, I mean, now that Dad is gone, and you're going to have the estate to manage, I thought maybe you could help us bridge a gap. Just for 6 months, $40,000. We'd pay it back. I wrote the check 3 days later. It felt like the right thing to do. Dennis and I had been comfortable, more than comfortable, though I didn't fully understand the scope of it yet, and Gerald was my son. And his father had just died. And $40,000 seemed like a reasonable way to help my child through a hard time. That was 26 months ago. I have not seen $1 of it returned. What followed was a pattern I can now trace with uncomfortable precision. Though I couldn't see it while I was in it. Grief does something to your peripheral vision. It narrows your focus to the immediate, to the next hour, to the next conversation. And anything that would require you to see the larger picture gets blurred at the edges. Over the following year, I contributed a new roof for Gerald and Vivian's primary home after they presented me with 3 contractor bids and a speech about how their insurance had failed them. $12,000 toward Cassidy's first semester at a private university in South Carolina. With the assurance that Gerald would handle the rest. He did not. I received another request 4 months later. A loan to Vivian's mother. Routed through Gerald. For an emergency I was never given details about. When I asked, Vivian told me it was complicated and changed the subject. I also paid for a vacation to Cabo San Lucas for Gerald, Vivian, and their 2 children. I was invited. The invitation was extended in a way that made it clear the invitation was the mechanism for the funding. Not a genuine desire for my company. I went. I sat by the pool and watched my grandchildren play in the ocean and told myself this was what family looked like. Total contributed in those 12 months. Somewhere in the range of $90,000. I only know this because our family attorney, a man named Warren Albright, sat me down at month 14 and showed me the numbers he'd been quietly tracking. Warren had been Dennis's attorney for 22 years. He had an office on the 3rd floor of an old building on Lexington Avenue with a waiting room that smelled like old paper and a receptionist named Doris who had worked there for longer than I'd been alive. He had called me 3 months after Dennis's death and said, gently, that there were some things in Dennis's estate that required a conversation. I went in expecting to sign paperwork. What he told me instead was that Dennis's estate was substantially larger than I had known. I need to stop here and explain something about Dennis. He came from nothing, a mill town in South Carolina. A father who worked 2 jobs. A mother who canned vegetables from a backyard garden to stretch the grocery budget. He built his business from a single landscaping truck to a regional operation with 40 employees over 30 years. Then sold it in parts across the early 2000s. He invested quietly, conservatively, without discussion or display, and told me we were set, without specifying what that meant. What it meant, I learned in Warren's office, was that I was sitting in front of a net estate of slightly over $4 million. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because the number was so far from the comfortable but modest life we had lived that my brain produced laughter as its only available response. Warren smiled patiently. Dennis was a private man. I knew that, I said. I didn't know it extended to this. He had reasons, Warren said, that I think will become clear. Then he told me about the codicil. Dennis had added it to his will 11 weeks before he died, the same period when his speech had become effortful. When he slept most of the day. When our conversations had that specific weight of things being said for the last time. While I was sitting with him in the evenings and thinking we were just talking. He had been having a separate set of conversations with Warren. The codicil was 2 pages. Warren read it to me in full. The language was legal, but the meaning was this: any of Dennis's descendants who publicly humiliated me, attempted to control my finances without my consent, attempted to remove me from my home against my wishes, or treated me with sustained contempt would forfeit their share of the estate entirely. That share would be redistributed equally among the remaining beneficiaries who had demonstrated genuine care and respect. Warren was named executor and sole arbiter of whether the conditions had been met. He had kept documentation. Why didn't he tell me? I asked. Warren folded his hands on the desk. He said something I'll quote as closely as I can remember. He said, "If Dorothy knows about the codicil, she'll feel like she's managing people instead of knowing them. I want her to see clearly without a net under her. And I want whoever treats her badly to do it without fear of consequences, so there's no ambiguity about who they really are." I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked Warren to tell me what had been documented so far. He slid a folder across the desk. The folder was not the reason I finally understood what was happening to me. The folder confirmed what I had begun to suspect without fully admitting. There is a difference between those 2 things. And the difference matters. The thing that made it undeniable, the thing I could not explain away or soften with context, happened 2 months after my meeting with Warren. It happened at my granddaughter Cassidy's 19th birthday party, at Gerald and Vivian's house in Charlotte. I drove down on a Friday afternoon. I'd baked Cassidy's favorite cake, a lemon layer cake with buttercream frosting that Dennis had always called architecturally ambitious. I'd wrapped a small piece of jewelry, a pearl bracelet that had been my mother's, that I'd been holding for the right moment to pass along. The party was a mix of Cassidy's college friends and family. I knew most of the adults. Gerald had hired a bartender for the evening, which struck me as slightly formal for a birthday in your own backyard. But I didn't comment. At some point in the evening, I went inside to use the restroom and found myself walking past Gerald's home office, the door of which was partially open. I was not trying to overhear anything. I was looking for the downstairs bathroom, which I had misremembered as being in a different hallway. What I heard stopped me. Gerald's voice, and then Vivian's, and then a third voice I recognized as belonging to Gerald's friend and colleague, a man named Porter, who I had met 3 or 4 times over the years. "The problem," Gerald was saying, "is that she's still in that house. It's 4 bedrooms. It's sitting on 1/3 of an acre in a neighborhood where values have gone up 40% in 3 years. And it's just her. She won't sell voluntarily?" This was Porter. "Not yet. But there are ways to move that conversation forward. We've been talking about Hillcrest Gardens." He paused. "It's a good facility. She'd be fine there. And the house, I mean, at current market, we're looking at 700, maybe 750 if we renovate the kitchen." "Who gets that?" "It's the estate asset," Gerald said, "so it redistributes according to the will. But the will's pretty straightforward." There was a sound of ice in a glass. Then Vivian. "The other issue is she's started making decisions on her own." "Did I tell you she gave Eli money?" "Eli?" Porter sounded confused. "For what?" "He's got some idea about expanding his business. She gave him $15,000. A pause. "She didn't tell us. We found out because Eli mentioned it." "That's your money she's giving away." "Technically, yes. Which is why we need to get the financial conversation on the table before she does anything else impulsive. Warren Albright has been useless. He's basically her ally at this point. We may need our own attorney." I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. Then I walked to the bathroom, washed my hands, looked at myself in the mirror, and went back to the party. I did not tell anyone what I had heard. I sang Happy Birthday to Cassidy and watched her open the pearl bracelet and mean it when she hugged me. Whatever was happening with her parents had not yet finished forming her. She was still someone I recognized. I drove home to Asheville that night instead of staying over as planned. I told Gerald I was tired. He said, with a slightly too careful smile, that he understood. The weeks that followed, I thought about Dennis constantly. Not in the acute, physical way of early grief, when his absence feels like a missing limb, but in the way of conversation, as if I were narrating my days to him and waiting for his response. "What would you do?" I asked him in my head, standing in the garden one morning with a cup of coffee, watching the early light come through the dogwood trees he'd planted the year we moved in. I knew the answer. Dennis was not a patient man when it came to protecting people he loved. He would have moved quickly, spoken directly, and not lost sleep over the fallout. But I was not Dennis. I was someone who had spent 41 years balancing his directness with my own tendency to wait, to observe, to hold things until I was sure. I called Renata. My daughter and I talked for 2 hours. I told her most of it, the financial patterns, the conversation I'd overheard, the question of the codicil, which I had not told her about before. She was quiet for most of it in the way that meant she was angry but managing herself. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet." "Mom," her voice tightened, "this isn't a misunderstanding. This is a plan. They have a plan." "I know." "Then you need one too." She was right. And the thing about having a plan, a real one, not just a vague intention to handle things, is that it requires you to know what outcome you actually want. And I spent a long time figuring that out. I didn't want revenge. Or rather, I wanted something more than revenge, which is harder to achieve and more satisfying when you do. I wanted clarity. I wanted to know exactly who my family was. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere that couldn't be argued away. And I wanted to protect the people who had been protecting me without knowing I needed it. Which is how Eli became central to everything. Eli Vance, my grandson, Dennis's biological grandchild through Gerald, was working at a plant nursery outside Asheville called Hollow Creek Gardens. He'd been there for 4 years, starting as a part-time employee when he was in his last year of community college, and had gradually become the owner, a woman named Mrs. Patton who was in her mid-70s, relied on for most of the operational decisions. He wanted to expand. Mrs. Patton was thinking about retiring and was open to a transition that kept the nursery in hands she trusted. Eli had told me about this over dinner at my kitchen table one October evening. Hesitantly, the way you tell someone something you care about when you're not sure how it will be received. He wasn't asking for anything. He was talking, the way he always did at my table, like he was thinking out loud and I was a safe person to think near. How much would it take to make that happen? I asked. He shifted in his chair. I don't want you to think I'm. Eli, how much? He told me. It was $15,000 to buy out Mrs. Patton's equipment, formalize the lease agreement, and have enough operating capital for the first season under his name. He had saved 11 of it. Then you need 4,000, I said. I need a little more than that for the cushion. 15, I said. You'll take the full 15. And you'll stop apologizing for needing things. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. And something in his face reminded me so much of Dennis, the particular way Dennis looked when he was moved but didn't want to show it, that I had to press my lips together. Thank you, he said, just that. It was the most uncomplicated transaction I'd had in 2 years. Gerald found out. I don't know how. Vivian mentioned it at the party. So perhaps Eli mentioned it to someone. He called me on a Tuesday morning. His voice carefully modulated in that way he had when he was managing himself. Mom, I heard you gave Eli some money for his business venture. I did. A pause. Don't you think that's something you should have discussed with the family first? No, I said, I don't. Another pause. Longer. I just think, with everything you have to manage, Dad's estate, the house, your own expenses, you should be careful about impulsive decisions. I'll keep that in mind. I said, how's Cassidy? He answered the question about Cassidy. We ended the call civilly. But something had shifted, and we both knew it. My 67th birthday fell on a Saturday in March. I had told Gerald I didn't want a fuss. He insisted, I want to revisit this moment now, with everything I know, and ask whether his insistence was genuine or strategic. And I still can't fully answer that. I think it may have been both. Gerald is not a simple person. He loves me in some real way and also sees me as a resource. And those two things coexist in him without much apparent tension. The dinner was at my house. Gerald and Vivian drove up from Charlotte. Renata flew in from Portland. She'd insisted on being there, which I was grateful for. Eli came. Cassidy came. Without her father's knowledge, I think. Or at least with some friction about it. Warren Albright attended. I had invited him. Quietly, telling him only that I thought his presence might matter. I cooked. I always cook for my own gatherings. Dennis used to say I cooked as a way of controlling the environment. Which was probably true and which I've never been bothered by. The first 2 hours were almost ordinary. We ate, talked about Renata's work, about Eli's nursery, which was 3 months into its new operation and already fuller than he'd projected. Cassidy told a story about her roommate that made everyone laugh. Gerald was on his best behavior, solicitous, attentive, saying the right things. Vivian was quiet. She had the particular quality of quiet that means someone is waiting. After the main course, while I was in the kitchen cutting the birthday cake, a simple olive oil cake with orange glaze, I heard Gerald clear his throat in the dining room in the way that precedes an announcement. I stopped cutting. There's something Vivian and I have been wanting to bring up, he began, and we thought, with everyone here who loves Mom, this might be the right moment to have the conversation. I heard Renata's chair shift. I heard nothing from Eli. We've been concerned, Gerald continued, about some of Mom's recent decisions. The financial gifts to certain family members. Without consulting anyone. The fact that she's managing the estate largely on her own. We all want what's best for her. And we think, Vivian and I think, and we've talked to an attorney about this, that it might be time to discuss a formal arrangement to help Mom with financial decisions. A silence. Then Renata. What kind of arrangement? A power of attorney, limited in scope, just for financial decisions, for her protection. I set down the cake knife. I stood in my kitchen for 1 breath. 2, 3. Then I picked up the cake and carried it to the table. Everyone looked at me. Gerald had an envelope in front of him, a birthday card. Or something in a birthday card envelope. Placed on the table while I was in the kitchen. Happy birthday, Mom, he said, pushing it toward me. I sat down. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Gerald. This is a birthday card? I asked. There's a card, he said, and something we'd like you to look at. I opened it. There was indeed a card. A generic one with a sunset on it and a printed message about wishing loved ones joy. And behind the card, folded in thirds, was a document, several pages, with Gerald's signature already on the designated line. I read the first page. It was, as he had described, a power of attorney, limited in scope, he'd said, but the scope defined in the document was broad. Financial decisions, medical decisions upon incapacity, management of real property assets. Real property assets, my house. I set the document on the table. Gerald, I said, where did you get this? An attorney we consulted. Mom, it's standard. Whose attorney? He said a name I didn't recognize. Not Warren's. Warren is the estate attorney. This is a separate matter. I see. I looked at Vivian. She held my gaze for a second. Then looked at her water glass. Mom, Gerald leaned forward. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to protect you. You've been making decisions. The money you gave Eli. Some of the things Warren has apparently been doing with the investments. We're not sure you have the full picture. What investments? Warren Albright said, from 2 seats down. Gerald blinked. He hadn't seen Warren come in. Or perhaps hadn't registered who he was. I'm sorry? I'm Warren Albright, Dennis Callahan's attorney. A pause. Dorothy's attorney. You mentioned concerns about investments. I'm curious which ones. A beat of silence. I didn't realize you were here, Gerald said carefully. Dorothy invited me. Warren picked up his fork. She mentioned she thought my presence might matter tonight. I'm beginning to understand why. Gerald looked at me. Something in his expression shifted. A recalculation. A new assessment of the room. He had assumed control of the evening. He was discovering he did not have it. Mom, he said, his voice quieter. This isn't what you think. I think, I said, that you drove 4 hours to hand me a legal document at my birthday dinner. Inside a birthday card, with your signature already on it. We were going to discuss. Gerald, I folded my hands on the table. I want to tell you something that your father told me. He said I was going to be fine. But I was going to have to learn to say no. I paused. I've been practicing. The table was very quiet. Warren cleared his throat gently. There's something I need to share with everyone. Dennis asked me not to raise it unless it became necessary. He looked around the table. I believe it's necessary. He reached into his jacket. Warren read the codicil aloud. Not all of it, just the operative provisions. The language was deliberate. Any descendant who publicly humiliated Dorothy, who attempted to control her finances without her consent, who attempted to remove her from her home against her wishes, who treated her with sustained contempt. He read the consequences: forfeiture of the entire share, redistribution to remaining beneficiaries who had demonstrated genuine care. He said the estate value. Gerald's face went white in stages. The way a glass fogs up from the bottom. Vivian's expression didn't change. She was either better at managing shock, or she was doing arithmetic. Renata pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled. Eli looked at the tablecloth. Cassidy, who had gone very still, said, Grandpa did that? He did, Warren said, about 10 weeks before he passed. Why didn't he tell anyone? Warren looked at me. I answered. He wanted people to show who they were without knowing there were consequences. A pause. He wanted me to know clearly. Gerald found his voice. This can't be legal. It is entirely legal, Warren said. I've had it reviewed by 2 additional attorneys in the past 18 months. It's sound. 18 months. Gerald stared at me. You've known for 18 months. Yes. And you let us. I watched. I said, your father asked me to see clearly. I was seeing clearly. You set us up. His voice was rising. You let us. Gerald. Renata's voice cut through the room. Stop. He turned to her. You handed Mom a power of attorney document inside a birthday card. Renata said steadily. You had it signed before she even read it. You've been borrowing money you haven't paid back for over 2 years. You've been talking to people about selling her house. Her voice was careful and precise. The voice of someone who has been quiet for a long time and is now choosing words carefully. Don't talk to me about being set up. Gerald's jaw tightened. He turned back to me. So that's it? Because of a few misunderstandings. Dad's going to punish me from the grave? I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about the landscaping truck. About the mill town. About Dennis crying twice in 41 years. And the second time being alone with me in our bedroom. And what he had said. Gerald, I said quietly, your father worked 30 years to build what he built. He didn't do it so you could have access to it without earning anything of your own. He did it so that if something happened to him, I would be safe. I reached across and picked up the power of attorney document. He never wanted to be the reason you had less, which is why he hoped this codicil would never be needed. I folded the document slowly. But he also loved me enough to make sure it existed. I looked at Warren. Enforce it, I said, please. The dinner ended without the cake being eaten. Gerald and Vivian left within 20 minutes of Warren's statement, Gerald barely speaking. Vivian not at all. Cassidy, to her credit, stayed. She sat with me at the kitchen table for another hour while Renata washed dishes and Eli quietly folded up the extra chairs. I didn't know any of that was happening. Cassidy said, I knew things felt off. But I didn't know. I believe you, I said. Are you angry at me? I looked at her. She had Dennis's coloring, the dark hair, the wide-spaced eyes. No, I said, you're 19. You don't get to be held responsible for your parents. But I'm an adult. You're a young adult, I said, which is different. You get credit for the growing you've done and grace for the growing you still have to do. She thought about this. What happens to my tuition? The money you'd been helping with? It was an honest question. Asked without performance. I appreciated that. I'll continue to help with your education. I said, because that's an investment in your future. Not a subsidy for your parents' lifestyle. But we'll set it up directly, paid to the institution. Not through Gerald. She nodded. Then, is this the last birthday dinner at this house? No, I said, I'm not going anywhere. This is my house. I paused. Your grandfather planted those dogwoods in the backyard. I intend to see them for another 20 years. The legal process unfolded over the following 4 months. Gerald hired an attorney and contested the codicil on 2 grounds, both of which were dismissed. Vivian's name was not on the estate documents in any case. She had no standing. The redistribution proceeded. I will not detail the exact financial breakdown, because frankly it is no one's business. What I will say is this. The portions that had been designated for Gerald went back into the estate trust, managed by Warren. With my oversight, a portion was placed in an education account for Cassidy and Brody, not controlled by their parents. Distributed directly upon proof of enrollment. A portion went to Renata outright, with no conditions, because she had never asked for anything and had always called. Eli received enough to secure Hollow Creek Gardens properly and build the greenhouse he'd been drawing on graph paper for 2 years. For myself, I did something Dennis would have approved of. I think. I took a trip, not a resort trip, not a cruise. Those have never appealed to me. I went to the Outer Banks for 2 weeks. To a small house a quarter mile from the ocean. with a stack of books and a sketchpad and no particular obligations. I walked on the beach every morning before the families arrived. I watched the light change on the water. I thought about 41 years and what they had contained and what they had not. I thought about the version of myself who had written a check 3 days after Dennis's funeral because she couldn't bear to say no to her grieving son. I didn't feel angry at that woman. She had done the best she could with what she understood. But I was glad to be becoming someone else. 8 months after the birthday dinner. I was in my garden on a Saturday morning, the rose garden, which I had let go somewhat and was reclaiming row by row, when I heard a car in the driveway. It was Gerald. He stood at the end of the walkway with his hands in his jacket pockets. Squinting slightly in the morning light, he looked older than I remembered from the dinner, which had only been 8 months ago. Or perhaps I was just looking at him differently. I would have called, he said. You could still call, I said. I kept my garden gloves on. You didn't have to drive 4 hours. I wanted to. He paused. Can I come in? We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had eaten dinner 100 times as a child. Where Dennis and I had sat over coffee for 40 years. I made tea because it was something to do with my hands. Gerald looked at the table for a while. Then he looked at me. I think, he said slowly, that after Dad died, I told myself a story. About the money. About what I was entitled to. About what you owed us. I waited. I told myself it wasn't really yours. That it was the family's. That Dad would have wanted us to use it. He stopped. That's not true. I knew that. I kept telling the story anyway because it was easier than asking myself why I needed so much. Why did you? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Not completely. I think I've been scared for a long time about not being enough on my own. And when there was money available, I used it instead of dealing with that. I thought about the mill town. About Dennis's father working 2 jobs. About the way wealth can skip a generation's wisdom while passing down its material effects. Gerald, I said, I'm not going to pretend the last 2 years didn't happen. I'm not going to tell you everything is fine. Because it isn't. He nodded. But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life with a son I don't know. I wrapped both hands around my teacup. Your father worked very hard for a very long time. And one of the things he worked hard for was the possibility that our family would be all right. Not the money, the family. I paused. He left behind a clause in a document that protected me. But he couldn't write a clause for everything. The rest of it, that's ours to figure out. Gerald's eyes went red at the edges. He pressed his mouth together the way Dennis used to when he was working hard not to cry. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. I mean that. I know, I said. And I think I did. We sat at the table for another hour. We didn't resolve anything. Exactly, I don't think one conversation can do that. And I'm suspicious of people who claim they can. But something shifted. Something that had been locked began, slowly, to loosen. He drove back to Charlotte in the afternoon. He called when he got home to tell me he'd made it safely. It was the first time he'd done that in years. Hollow Creek Gardens had its busiest spring on record. I know this because Eli called me every week or so to report. Not because I asked him to, but because he wanted to. He'd hired 2 additional employees, signed a contract with a local hotel's landscaping account, and was starting a small workshop program teaching container gardening to beginners. I want to name something after Grandpa, he told me one Sunday. A section, or a plant variety. Is that strange? What kind of section? The native plants area. He loved native plants. He always said a garden should look like it belongs to the place it's in. Dennis had said exactly that. Many times. I had forgotten he'd said it until Eli repeated it. He would have loved that. I said. I'm going to call it the Dennis Callahan Native Garden. I sat for a moment after the call ended. In the kitchen, with the phone in my hand and the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink. He knew things about Dennis that I hadn't told him. Things Dennis must have said to him in the small amounts of time they'd spent together. Seeds, planted carefully, that had grown in the right conditions. I've been asked, by Renata, By Warren. By a few friends who know the story. Whether I regret not acting sooner. Whether the 18 months of watching cost me something. I've thought about it honestly. And I think the answer is no. Not because the watching didn't cost anything, it did. There were nights in those 18 months that were very dark. There were moments when I wanted to call Gerald and say everything directly and have it be done. But if I had, I would not have clarity. I would have confrontation, which ends in either capitulation or estrangement. And neither of those is truth. What I have now is truth. I know who in my family saw me as a person and who saw me as a resource. I know who rose to the occasion when it mattered and who did not. That knowledge is worth the cost of 18 months. Dennis knew this. He designed the codicil to let time do its work. He was, as he had always been, the more strategic of the two of us. On what would have been our 43rd anniversary, I went out to the garden in the early morning, before the heat came up, and stood by the dogwoods he planted. I talked to him for a while, told him about Eli's nursery, about Renata's promotion, about Cassidy, who had declared a major in environmental science and called me last week to ask if I thought she'd be good at it. I told him about Gerald, and how we were figuring it out slowly. The way hard things get figured out. I told him I was all right. I told him I'd learned to say no. The dogwoods were in bloom. They had been in bloom every April since the year we moved in. Because Dennis had chosen the variety carefully and planted them in the right light and given them the right conditions to do what they were made to do. He had a way of knowing which things, given the right conditions, would turn out fine. Including me. If this story reached something in you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one.